talk some about the clinical trials situation and the Institute of Medicine report that came out just about 6 weeks ago and the impact that has on research?
What I thought was so interesting about that IOM report is that it still supported, I think, the idea that clinical trials need to be large to get data. And I think what we're seeing is that there are targeted therapies and subpopulations. And so I think we really need to look at that IOM report and think about kind of changing the paradigm of clinical trials and how they will work for these subpopulations. And maybe there are some subpopulations for whom targeted therapies are these home runs that we're really looking for. But large clinical trials may not be the future of research.
When we go back to the issue of clinical trials, we're seeing in our organization still some very basic issues around education with patients around clinical trials. We are still seeing that patients essentially oftentimes believe three things about clinical trials. They believe that you are going to get a placebo in a cancer treatment trial. We hear that all the time. They believe that you are going to be treated poorly in a clinical trial, and they believe that the only reason you should consider a clinical trial is as a last-ditch effort when everything else has failed. So I would say, I know we're looking at trying to reform other parts of the clinical trial system and re-looking at reimbursement and how trials are structured and looking at the consent process, but I also think we have a lot of work to do still in the part of educating patients.
We published a brochure on understanding clinical trials because, again, we agree people need to be better educated about what trials are so they can ask their oncologists or their providers questions to see if they're eligible. But the title of the brochure is Understanding Breast Cancer Treatment Research Studies, because when we spoke to medical advisors and consumer advisors, they advised us if you put clinical trials on the cover, not many people may open it. So if we want people to read and become educated, we've got to use a language that may become more accessible to the broader population.
I think it's very notable about the word clinical trials. What we try to do at the Lymphoma Research Foundation is incorporate the concept and the education around clinical trials into our publications and the programs that we provide.
People have been looking for the silver bullet. And I don't think the silver bullet exists. We just finished up the first phase of a study where we're doing treatment decision counseling with patients with blood cancers, where we're sitting down with them. We have trained counselors sitting down with patients and families to actually talk about what trials are. And in the first phase of this study, patients have a decrease in anxiety, a decrease in decisional regret, and we had in the first phase of the study 20% of these patients who enrolled in a clinical trial. So I really think when you sit down, when you educate patients, when you take the time to advance these interventions, these conversations are not happening with the medical team.
If 80% or so of patients are treated in the private sector, now I live in California, so I can speak for what it's like in my area of the country.
Right.
It's a great concern, the number of patients who'll say to me, I saw my private practice doctor, but he or she really doesn't want to engage in this discussion. Now, if we're up to a phase 3 for sure, phase 2 trials possibly, some of the academic centers will say, stay with your medical oncologist, right. We can share you. Right. Medical oncologists don't want to necessarily refer their patients for the second opinion about the clinical trial for fear that they may lose that patient. Yeah. So in addition to educating the patient, I have a concern that the private practice provider, right, who doesn't want to take the clinical trials process on in the office, is too time consuming.
Right.
What about, they're a big part of the problem.
They are, and again, as Diane said, we're talking about it with providers, talking about it with organizations like ASCO for years. Yeah. I think that certainly in our organization, what we're dedicated to is the patient being educated and the patient being empowered. We certainly recognize the fact that there is not a trial for every patient, but the way that the conversation has shifted inside of these counseling sessions and these discussions is to look at a clinical trial upfront as a treatment option. That this idea that a clinical trial is a last resort is not the way you should be thinking about them. That you need to, maybe there is a trial that is right for you, maybe there is not. But from our perspective and within our organization, we believe that the patient needs to be educated, that the patient needs to drive the conversation, and if through their education and empowerment they realize that there is a trial that's out there that's right for them, then they need to move along or move away from the physician that they're with to find that trial if they determine with their team around them that that may be the best choice for them right now.
We absolutely know that in brain tumors there is no silver bullet, and it is going to be a some kind of combined therapy and multiple therapies at once or in succession. And what we find is that even the trials that are coming out today, the comparison arm is not what we would be giving people in treatment right now today. And so it is so hard to use that to instruct patients or to work with patients to understand what does that actually mean, how is that relevant to me. And I think this is actually a very critical thing that statistically has to be worked out in clinical trial design. How are we going to look at these multiple therapies? Because I don't know about some of the other groups in here, but for us that seems to be the only possible way that we're going to make the kind of progress that you optimistically are hoping for, and that I'm hoping for in my heart and spirit, but that we haven't seen yet.
In melanoma, and I know in other cancers as well, we haven't had a drug approved in 12 years, and 85% of people take a drug get no benefit at all. So the standard of care really is a clinical trial. So the best choice for patients is which clinical trial to go into.
I'm involved in clinical trials most directly as the head of the patient rep committee at ECOG. And over the years, I think we've all had these discussions about the barriers, and Diane's right, they're always the same. But we often notice, though, that there are some trials where there's virtually a stampede to get in the trials. And they're trials that really are consumer friendly. They appeal to the patient because there's an exciting new drug, or there's a potential for a better result in a place where there isn't a good outcome generally. So I think that a lot of trials get designed, particularly outside of the government-funded system. We always say the government-funded system is horrible in terms of how slow it is and how hard it is to get things done, but it is the only place where certain types of questions get asked and certain consumer and patient issues really get addressed. And I think if we're headed more in a route where we're privatizing clinical trials, that's going to get worse, because drug companies think about what's this trial need to look like to get my drug approved, as opposed to what does this trial need to look like so that the patients that are in this trial are going to get better care and better options than people that aren't in the trial. So I think that we have to find a way, as all this evolves, where there's a consumer orientation, there's a focus on patient outcomes for trial participants, and not just structuring a trial to get a drug approved or to get a biomarker proven that's going to help patients down the road, but how is the trial going to really appeal to patients, because it's going to help the patients that are in that trial.
As we're talking about cost, we're also talking a lot about adding a cost, a very important cost, and that is the education and empowerment of patients. And right now that, if medical care is patchworked, psychosocial care is even more patchworked, and there is, in many situations, just no way to do that on an individual basis with patients.
And I've been listening to this, and I'm thinking, okay, you want to get the patient into clinical trials. Now, I walk into a doctor's office, and the doctor says, you have cancer. I'm not even a patient at that point, I'm a puddle. And I don't understand anything that happens after that. And how do we reach these people who don't even know what cancer is? And if their physician does not say, this is what you need to know, this is a patient advocacy group that can really give you information about that, or you might want to consider clinical trials as one of the first-line treatments, they are not going to even get to first base.
We have to teach patients to do what's best for them, and we have to give them the tools, the resources, the framework, and the education to make the decisions that are best for them.